So we don't have long with this particular group. We're going to only have 22 minutes. So we're going to speed through things. But what I wanted to say at the very top was that in this particular panel, we're not actually dealing with the far future. We're not really dealing with technologies that are way out there. We're actually dealing with the world that you're already living in, whether you know it or not. That's all I'm going to say. I want you to hear from the esteemed panelists. Starting at my far left, Joy Bolamwini.
Yes.
Thank you. Is a graduate researcher at MIT's Civic Media Lab. She's the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. And she was not just a Rhodes Scholar, but also a Fulbright Scholar. Kate Darling, who's sitting right next to me, is a researcher at the MIT Media Lab. Kind of has a history in IP law and has been focused primarily on robot ethics for the last several years. And in the middle is Heather Roth. She is a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford, a research scientist in the Global Security Initiative at Arizona State, and a national cybersecurity fellow at the New America Foundation. Lots of research. So how many people here think of algorithms, or let's just say the software running on computers and in devices, as like more or less neutral? Like kind of it's just computing things. People think kind of neutral. And how many think of the software that's running computers as having sort of an inherent bias? Interesting.
Well,
all right.
I mean, there might be a selection bias here. They did come to this session.
That is true. That is true. I think one of the things that we encounter commonly, all of you guys in your work, is the sense that algorithms are neutral, that software is neutral. So Joy, why don't we start out with you? I kind of want you to tee up a video that we're going to show that you made about facial recognition algorithms. And maybe you can just explain how it came about and how it relates to your research.
Sure. So the video that's going to be shown is something I debuted at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, talking about the coded gaze, which is analogous to the male gaze or the white gaze, interrogating the perspectives that are put onto the code we create that we might not always realize. And so I've had this experience of having to change myself to fit technology to accommodate how people perceived technology should work, and that's what this video shows.
Let's explain it. That's totally fine. We can explain what the work is.
Sure. So essentially in this video, I'm coding in a white mask, and I was working on a project I started at the Media Lab to project a lion onto my face in a mirror, just for fun. And then I had another project where I wanted to paint walls with my smile, so my face would become a face brush that would be projected with smiley faces, just for fun. I found that I needed to use computer vision, and in particular facial detection software, to get this to work. But it didn't work consistently on my face until I wore a white mask. And then it almost worked flawlessly. And I thought it was a little ridiculous, but I didn't really get a sense of urgency from it until I learned about the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. So over 117 million people in the US, so 1 in 2 adults, have their faces in a facial recognition network that can currently be audited while searched with algorithms that haven't been audited for accuracy, even though there's evidence that shows it doesn't work across a range of faces. And so it was this personal experience of trying to paint a wall with my smile or project a lion onto my mirrored reflection that got me exploring areas of algorithmic bias, not just for computer vision, but in other areas in which machine learning is being used.
So Heather, maybe we can go to you. What are some of the...
They have the video?
Oh, we do have the video. Well, in that case, let's play it. Yeah.
I have a confession.
I kind of ruined the confession, but.
Sometimes, with no one in sight, I code in a white mask. As I make whimsical systems to paint walls with our smiles or project inspirations on faces, I enjoy using code to make my ideas a reality. Computer vision powers my creations, making it possible for machines to detect faces. But at times, I'm invisible. You see, machines view the world through a coded gaze. They digest pixels from a camera in dictated ways. Using machine learning, we create training sets with examples that help the machines detect new faces. A lack of diversity in these training sets leads to limited systems that can struggle with faces like mine. To save time, code libraries for facial recognition are shared like off-the-shelf parts. Many computer vision projects share the same code. Any bias in the system propagates widely and implants a coded gaze. The coded gaze reflects the views of whoever creates the systems. All of our work reflects both our aspirations and our limitations. Can we do better? Yes. We can begin by intentionally creating inclusive code. I call this encoding. Encoding is a mindset that asks, who's missing? Detecting the invisible is easier when you have full spectrum teams equipped with different light filters. Who codes matters. Encoding is a process that explicitly checks the impact of bias during the design, development, and deployment of coded systems. How we code matters. Encoding is a personal mission and an invitation to create a world with a culture of inclusion, a world where technology works for all of us and centers social change. No more masks.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to show this is I just wanted us to all have kind of an object to think with, right? That we can look at the way that this facial recognition software works, and that helps us think about the way that algorithms could become biased. So Heather, I wanted to go to you. How can bias creep in the data set and how the data is analyzed? And you can just talk about how that might work.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways that bias can creep into data. And one of the things that, I'm a social scientist by training, so I create data sets. And then I use those data sets to find patterns and to analyze things and try to answer questions. My most recent data set I created was on autonomous weapons systems, or at least automated weapon systems, encoding what features of a weapon system are already automated so that we can kind of understand the progress going forward in this space and where we've seen kind of developments and where we're seeing pushes. But doing that, right, I have to be very, very mindful of a rigorous system of coding, right? I have to code all the systems the same. There needs to be, if there's another person that I'm coding, so if I had grad students coding for me, at one point I did, they have to have inter-coder reliability. I have to have coding checks, right, to make sure that they're coding the systems in the same way. Otherwise, if they have some sort of misunderstanding about the object that they're looking at or they're interpreting it in a different way, that data is going to be biased towards their interpretation. Most of my data sets are pretty simple, and we can do it in binary, it's a 0 or a 1. But even in that space, you can end up having quite a bit of bias depending upon who's doing that coding. It becomes even more dangerous, I think, when we're talking about events-based data, particularly in political science, or in anything having to do with sociology or human behavior, because those are all interpreted by the coder, him or herself. So what I might see as an act of aggression, another person might see as an act of defense. So those types of things are inherently kind of political and cultural, and you have to have very rigorous standards in a research methodology to ensure that you can interrogate the data and that you can also look at the code books and the inter-coder reliability.
I mean, what did you find in facial recognition technology that made it work inconsistently on your face versus a white face?
Sure, so I started looking at some of the benchmarks we use to say how well we're doing at a particular task when we're looking at computer vision. And so one of these benchmarks that I looked at was actually 75% male and what I call 83% pale. And so when you're looking at that sort of data set to represent how we're doing overall for all of humanity, there's a bit of a skew. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to see how we can make more inclusive benchmarks so we're not kidding ourselves about how well we're doing.
Yeah. One area that I know all three of you are concerned about bias creeping in is around policing, and in particular, predictive policing algorithms that can be used in some cases to deploy police resources around a city or an area, usually based on historical crime data. So what would be, maybe people in the room are thinking, it actually sounds like a pretty good idea. Like, what's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, first of all, these systems are already being used, in case people don't know that, in a variety of cities. I think New York, but a few others. And some of the problems with using historical data are that historical data is often biased and often racially biased, for example. And if you embed that into the algorithms, then it just perpetuates this bias moving forward. So like, I guess like a good standard example of how this can work is from the introduction of the book Weapons of Math Destruction, which is a really good intro to this topic generally, by Kathy O'Neill. And so if you imagine you're a tech company and you want to hire engineers and you want the algorithm to help you sift through, you know, the CVs of the engineers you want to hire, then you might look at, okay, what engineers have we hired in the past? What attributes do they have? How well did they end up doing in the company? And then you have the algorithm select CVs, and what you're going to get is mostly men, because you're using historical data and there haven't been many women in the field, and that will just lead to more men being hired. And so you can imagine similar effects in the criminal justice system if you're relying on historical data.
Yeah, I mean, to follow on Kate's point too, there needs to be a realization that crime is committed everywhere, and we commit crimes all the time. And those come in very, you know, mild variety forms of jaywalking or a taillight out on your car or something like this. And so if you're deploying resources to an area to look for crime in that area, you're gonna find it, okay? So in that sense, you're priming the pump, right? What you're doing is you're saying, I'm looking for something, I'm gonna go find it. And I think that, again, entrenches these very structural injustices that we're trying to actually get away from without us seeing it. It's becoming, I think, invisible, as Joy's work has shown.
And to add to that, one of the things that's really concerning to me are that the people who are impacted by the technology might not themselves be that represented, right? So the MailPel data set that I'm talking about, now you're looking at the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. And so there's a huge mismatch between who's represented within the training data and the benchmarks and who's being impacted by the technology.
And in fact, I don't know if any of you saw this recently, but yesterday it was announced that in, was it Qatar? No. UAE, just, I think maybe it was UAE or Qatar, I can't remember, just deployed an autonomous robot police car with an attendant autonomous drone to police the area, right? So that they could chase down criminals. How they actually apprehend them, given there's no person around, I don't quite know, but there's an autonomous car and then there's a drone. So it's again, but they're using, and in the articles noted, they're saying they're using biometric targeting analysis, which facial recognition. Right?
Is there any reason why we shouldn't just say software instead of algorithms? Like, because I can imagine maybe people are comfortable thinking about software, but not about algorithms. Is there something specific about having the Algorithmic Justice League as opposed to the Software Justice League?
I think one thing that we need to realize is the stage in which we're in when it comes to algorithmic development. And so once we start looking at learning algorithms which are being used for machine learning and more broadly artificial intelligence, this use of the term algorithm is focused on these processes, right, that are trying to emulate human intelligence in some way. So we could say software, and that's fine. I say algorithm because Algorithmic Justice League sounds a lot better than Software Justice League.
And what are you pushing for? I mean, do you collectively or individually want government regulation of certain types of algorithms that are deployed in certain areas? Do you want a third party to sort of verify that algorithms have fair outcomes? Like, what would you want to have happen?
So part of the goal of the Algorithmic Justice League is to expand who has a voice and a choice around the use of algorithms, particularly in areas of high impact decision making, right? So I like to say we have the Digerati or the Brahmin of tech dictating, right, what will happen with the use of the algorithms we have right now, and the people who are impacted might not even be aware, right, that there's a drone flying around with biometric capabilities that might not necessarily be tuned to their phenotypes in the first place. And so I think there's this huge work of awareness that needs to happen, but also on the policy side, if we're thinking about how we go through a process of procuring various systems or software or algorithms, as you would like to call it, are we checking to make sure it's inclusive in the first place instead of assuming de facto that it works flawlessly?
Yeah, and I think to follow on to Joy's point, I mean, I'm mostly most concerned. That's very eloquent. I'm mostly concerned that when we're talking about algorithms in these software packages deployed around very sensitive areas, particularly like rights, so thinking about recidivism rates, ProPublica stuff. If we're thinking about,
Can you dwell on that example for a minute? Because I think people would probably be intrigued by.
Yeah, so ProPublica did a great story and spread on an algorithm used to predict recidivism rates and how the outputs of that algorithm affected sentencing decisions. So someone had already offended, they were in jail, and then they used the algorithm to basically say how likely they are to reoffend if we let them out. ProPublica found that this data was heavily racially biased, and in some senses gender biased. And so what they found was that mostly African American men were never paroled, right? They were always seen to be more likely to offend, when in fact, when they dug into the algorithm, they found that actually a lot of white men and a lot of white women actually offended in cases where they were said they were unlikely to. So the algorithm was telling them to do a particular sentencing move that was actually quite unjust, and you were keeping people in jail longer than they needed to be based on the outcome of the algorithm. So the exposure of this, I think, is crucial, because what we see is, nobody actually in that case wanted to interrogate what it was doing. They thought, oh, this is going to be so helpful for us. This will, automate some of our workload. We don't have to go through and really peek in at the individual in front of me. I'm just going to put, their biometrics in and see what comes out. And I think that's really dangerous. And so I think what we need to do is have any, states or militaries or governments who are procuring software like this or in this wheelhouse to really peek inside and say, I want to see the data. I want to see that it's verified by a third party. I want to make sure that it's doing what you say it's going to do, and not just assume that because I can plug in the software into my computer and it spits out an answer that it's truth.
Yeah.
And it's also my understanding is that it's really hard to find recourse as an individual. So it's getting more difficult to even get an explanation for why some decision was made over whether you can get a loan or
get a job,
get
out of jail,
why you were fired as a teacher.
Right.
And people can't give you the answer because they don't know. They've outsourced these tasks to companies that are helping them be more efficient, and it's all in a black box, and nobody really knows, but everyone's like, well, it's the algorithm, it's neutral, it must be doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one counter-argument I've heard is that people tend to be quite biased, and so say in hiring decisions, people tend to make sexist and racist hiring decisions, and you see it in many cases. And so even if the algorithms did encode some sort of bias, they might do better than an actual individual person. And I think the question that raises is just sort of what is the standard to which we're going to hold these algorithms, like human fallibility or something better?
Well, we were talking a little bit about this yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I think human parity as a benchmark depends on the context, right? And so
and the human.
And the human as well. So when we're looking at something like a hiring decision, sure, you can say humans are biased as well, but if we're putting all of this trust and faith within the technology, we need to be rigorous about checking the outcomes itself. Are we taking it at face value? Or are we going in to check to see, are these decisions fair, depending on how you define fairness, and that's going to be based on the values that are prioritized by a particular organization or the people who are also developing the systems as well. So whether or not humans are biased, right, and that bias creeps into the systems we develop, that's one thing, but because we know bias can be embedded in the technology, let's do better.
And I think being aware of it, being mindful of it, encoding it. This is a research design question. So, part of my expertise is how do you do research, right? How do you make a research design? What is your question? Where do you get the data? How do you then use the techniques to analyze that data? And that has to be reflexive, right? So you have to say something like, okay, I'm not just going to pull this data set. I'm going to scrape it from someplace. I don't know anything about it. I'm going to use it in my work, and I'm going to perpetuate this. You actually have to be a lot more reflexive about it. Also in the generation of the data, I think it was Google DeepMind's more recent, they have a paper that just came out. They released a machine vision learning data set with 300 different behaviors. So this is a big jump, because the last one had like 7 or 8 behaviors, and now they just released a data set of 300. They use videos from YouTube.
That just means they can recognize behaviors.
Exactly, so like sewing or playing basketball or doing nails or crying or things like this. And so what they did was, you can download their paper from their website. They did a bit of sensitivity analysis, and they said, because we're getting the videos from YouTube, do we have any problems with some of the behaviors? And they did find that in like one instance, I know crying, right? The algorithm could not identify an adult crying. It could only identify babies crying, right? And so those are just, but in writing that report, they were very reflexive about saying, take some of this data with a grain of salt. Don't think that this is pure and clean and it's going to give you everything you want. And that is, I think, a first step at talking about this kind of inclusivity.
I think another big difference between human decision-making and this decision-making by machines is that people are increasingly able to kind of deflect responsibility for the decision. You take Google and their search ranking algorithm, and they can always say, oh, we're really sorry that when you search for Jews, you get a hate group as the first search result. It's not the position of our company. And we might say, okay, we're fine with that in the case of search result ranking, but there are plenty of cases where we do want people to take personal responsibility, and it's so much easier to just say, well, the algorithm is being efficient.
I think the thing that is difficult to imagine, and it comes out of the particular experience I had watching the DMV hearings in California for self-driving cars. You watch the regulators try and deal with Google and the other sort of applicants to have autonomous vehicles on the road in California, and they themselves were like, we don't have the capacity to evaluate what it is that you're doing. And so it requires, self-policing by the companies, capacity development by government agencies, an algorithmic justice league. It's actually a kind of hard problem, because every DMV is now going to have that problem.
Yeah, so a friend of ours, Ryan Kalo, at the University of Washington Law School, has suggested that what we really need is something like an FDA for algorithms, right? What we really need is, in these corner cases or in these high impact areas, what we really need is either a federal kind of entity or maybe a third party entity, like what you're thinking about in banking and loans and things like this, that can come through and say, we have the expertise and we can certify that this is above board, and it's not going to be something like VW and trying to cut corners on emissions testing, right? And peeking into the code and seeing that they're actually cheating. So I think that might be something to think forward.
Huh. And how many people here think that would be a good idea? It's interesting, huh?
Ryan spoke about this here 2 years ago.
He did,
oh, interesting. Yeah. FDA for algorithms.
He wanted to come back too. He told me he was bummed he couldn't come this
yeah, he would be such a good addition to this whole track.
Do you all feel that things change when you embody an algorithm in a robot? I know because Ryan Kalo, the guy they just mentioned, believes that robots change everything. I mean, that's an overstatement of his position, but it's close.
I agree with him.
Why is that?
Well, he did some work years ago about privacy and robotics, and the way that the physicality of the robot changes people's perception of whether they perceive their privacy being violated or not. So if you imagine, drones flying over your backyard, that's creepy. We don't really like that idea, but high-resolution satellite imaging systems way up in the sky that we can't see, or whatever. The government's reading our email, and that type of thing. So I think physicality can make a difference, but also there's a lot of bias that can creep into the design of robots, physical robots, that what types of voices they have, or how their bodies are constructed if they're humanoid. So that's a whole other area, a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, some of my work has looked at that in the
Oh yeah, you've written about this.
The gendered nature of robotics, right? How we gender robots, both from the AI side, like why you would want to, and then how that would work, and then also on the physical side. And so it's not just merely kind of like an essentialism of in fact, it was one of my favorite blog posts that I wrote for the Monkey Cage called "Robots Don't Lactate." Because I was just like, why are we giving robots breasts? They don't have any functional purpose for that. So
she had another funny example yesterday, which was the Fox football robot.
Yeah.
Everybody know that guy? Like,
remember from when you're watching football games and you would have the Fox little robot come up on the corner of the screen? He would do this thing and it would drive me mad, right? He would scrape his neck like this and he'd go like this. And I was like, why is he stretching in this weird masculine postury way when he's a robot? He doesn't have muscles. Like that's just silly, right? And so you start to realize like the gendered performance of this like hyper masculine robot, and you're like, okay. I mean, it's just so bizarre, right? And so it got me to thinking about this, and I looked at DARPA's robotic challenge these last couple years, and looking at the guidelines of that challenge was to just create a robot, but they all created humanoid robots. No one told them to, but they started to do it, and then they started to gender them without even thinking about it.
Oh yeah, Andra Kay also has a great paper looking at the names that people give robots in robot competitions, and it's like
Thor.
The male robots are like
Helios.
and the few female robots that they have are named Candy or like something highly sexualized. It's
Although
really
NASA's
disgusting.
was Valkyrie, and they
That's
finally
true.
came
That's
out.
kind
that
of awesome.
But they called her Val.
and I think the larger point of this, right, is that our notions about gender and the world creep into the code, right?
Totally.
So for the people here, you have a lot of people who may run companies, who may have technologists who come to them and say, hey, I have this wonderful new machine learning technology that I'd like to deploy within our company. How can they think better about the problems that you've brought up in practice, in actually rolling out technologies within their institutions?
Some of them are hiring Heather. That's always a good move.
I say nothing.
Well, I think this mindset of full spectrum inclusion can be informative, especially when we're looking at data-centric technologies. And so for a data-centric technology like artificial intelligence, data is destiny. And right now we're destined to be biased if we're not intentional about being intersectional with the types of data we're bringing together and who's represented. So I think that's one concrete area companies can look at, which is to see how representative their data sets are. I think another thing that can happen is to look at how representative the benchmarks themselves are, where we're saying performance on this benchmark tells us something about the state of the art. We need to make sure those performance metrics are also inclusive. So if there was one thing I would take away from this panel, would be to think with the full spectrum inclusion mindset at the design, development, and deployment of any technology that you're creating.
And to double down on that, to also just think about who you're hiring in your companies and the values that they hold. So actually thinking about so you want to hire a machine learning expert or a software engineer. You want to ask them questions like about inclusivity and rights and justice and things like this, and whether or not their values maybe align with your company's mission, and trying to fit those right people there. Because if you get the right people doing these things and they're thinking about them in a mindful way, downstream when they create those products for you, it'll be better and better.
Yeah, and you really need diverse teams, right? Because you can hire the most well-intentioned young white dudes, they'll try to do the right thing, but they have blind spots because they don't experience the world the way that some other people do.
Exactly.
We are going to take questions. We have, I think, about 8 minutes. We have mic runners. We have a woman right here in the front.
Giselle?
Giselle.
So in education and healthcare, it seems to me that the algorithms are doing something much more positive than what you're describing. And how does that play into the way you're approaching this? Because the algorithms are gathering data, huge sets of data that enable practitioners to adapt their delivery to the particular customer of it, the student or the patient. How does that play into what you're talking about?
So can I just one quick, so there's one way, and then I want Kate to follow on this, but so think about this. Think about VR, visual reality, or virtual reality, sorry. The headsets, these big things that you might have even used some of them around here, were primarily designed only on men and the way men's eyes are. And so when women actually use them for prolonged periods, they get migraines. So the idea is, right, thinking about even the data, if you're only taking images of cancers that are from one race or one set of people, this is not going to be the type of data that will be universal in travel. It's the same thing that happened we do back in the 50s and 60s with drug testing only on men. And then because there was a taboo about doing any sort of drug testing on women, particularly pregnant women. And so then the way those drugs affect women have become much different because we didn't have the data. So I think actually, even in healthcare, we have to have very, very clear, like, eyes wide open about that kind of data accumulation.
And building on healthcare, I advise a startup called Bloomer Tech that looks at women's cardiovascular health. And less than a quarter of research participants for cardiovascular health are women, and what is taught in the medical schools are based on a male model for cardiovascular disease, even though 1 in 3 women, right, die of cardiovascular disease. So assumptions that are made about how well our predictions are doing don't always interrogate the data sets that are being used to infer these predictions, or even going back to the cancers we're talking about. There's a lot of excitement about the fact that at this point we've reached human parity for melanoma classification, right? So the computers can do it as well as dermatologists, but I'm wondering, are we asking how well does it perform across many different skin types and so forth? So it's easy to assume that when we hear these announcements about how well we're doing, that it's universal and it's generalizable, and hopefully that's the case, but we have to be rigorous in checking.
I just want to note, just really quickly, I don't know if this has come across, but I think we're all really excited about the promise of some of these systems. We just want to get it right, and it will be awesome if we can get it right.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like the promise of beneficial AI applications is huge, and they are going to be very disruptive in a wide variety of industries. But they're going to entrench terrible structural injustices if we are not careful about how we gather that data and interrogate that data.
Take a couple more questions right here, and then we'll go over there.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Do you guys believe if programmers and developers are more cognizant of these biases and implement them into the technology, then once these technologies become more mainstream, people will become more inclusive themselves?
One thing I want to caution against is thinking of bias as something to eradicate, or we can absolutely get rid of it in every context. We have to think about being bias aware, or something I call machine learning hygiene, right? So you wouldn't just shower once, say you're done for 3 years, and then you show up a little smelly and you're wondering what happened, right? So it has to be a continuous process. In terms of it being making society more inclusive, I think about the importance of representation. So for example, when Slack came out with icons that were actually multicolored, right, that made a huge impact for certain people to say, okay, people are thinking about inclusion. I think about representation when we look at media or panels, right? Who has a voice and who's talking about AI, and what does that say? So I think one of the dangers might be, well, we can keep the same teams and we can be more aware, and then we'll be all right because our tech will reflect being inclusive, when we're not realizing being inclusive means also bringing more people to the table to be part of that process of making tech and also applying tech in different areas. The fact I started a hair care technology company with 3 other women of color with backgrounds in computer science and chemical engineering is because we're coming from different life experiences, right? And now we have a nice little profitable situation. But you know, so you're just going to have different types of ideas when different people are in the mix.
I would also suggest too, like when you read articles about AI in the news, which every day we're flooded with like either doomsday or, you know, it's either going to be like manna from the heavens or it's going to be like hellfire and brimstone. But either way, when you read it and be reflective yourself. When they talk to experts in the field, count how many of the experts in the field that they cite are pale and male.
The question's a really good one, though. I mean, if the work gets done that you want to get done, yeah. Do you think it changes society in a positive way beyond the code itself or the algorithm?
It's possible. I mean, I don't know. My field is more physical robots, and I think definitely with physical robot design, you can challenge stereotypes rather than entrench them if people are thinking enough about this. Like, I wish IBM Watson had a female voice most of the time, or as a default.
Yeah.
We had another question right there.
Hi, I'm here because Walter Isaacson said go to something that you don't know very much about. So please forgive me if my question is rather basic. Heather, I believe you said that you need to delve into algorithms. And as I understand it, algorithms, as you explained it, are based on data that are then encoded. What happens when the data changes? Are the algorithms somehow updated on an automatic way that is going to reflect new cutting-edge discoveries or new data, such as with the recidivism rates? And how do you delve into an algorithm?
I can provide half, and if you want to take it, you can take it, or I can provide a kind of simple answer to it. It really depends on how the algorithm is trained on the data. Some of them are being updated constantly. They're in a feedback loop with the data all the time. In others, you train a model, and it sort of stays that way, and you run it, and you can get results out of it without retraining on all the data that you had. And how you delve into it, I'll let you take that one, actually.
Well, it depends. I mean, so an algorithm is math, right? I mean, it's mathematical equations, right? And so that's, I mean, one side of it. So if, I'm looking at, if I'm a reinforcement learning algorithm, I'm probably using like a Markov decision process or something, right? I'm doing something. I'm doing a lot of math. And then that, and by the way, I'm a social scientist who does like stats in a totally different way than writing algorithms and code. So total, disclosure on that one. But what I would say is that in that instance, right, if you're thinking about an unsupervised learning algorithm that's taking in sensory data like all the time, right? So an autonomous vehicle, it's learning all the time, right? And so in that sense, it's rewriting its code as it's learning and as it's getting new experiences. In these supervised cases where you can freeze it, what you're doing is you're just saying, I have this thing, I trained it, I tweaked it when I saw it was doing something I didn't want it to do, and then I deployed it. And it's taking in sensory data or it's taking in something from perception from the environment, but it's not changing itself, right? It's just going to give you outputs based on the inputs it's getting.
All right, I think that is all the time we have. Thank you very much, panelists.
So I'll have my youth hat on and a little bit of my international relations major hat on at the same time while we have this conversation. Dmitri Alperovitch is the co-founder and CTO of CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity firm, and was previously a VP of threat research at McAfee. He's a noted inventor. He has 18 patented technologies, more than a decade of experience in information security. And so let us just jump in starting with cybersecurity. So CrowdStrike was thrust into history, I guess, probably, or at least the limelight, when you were the first to discover the Russian intelligence hacking of the DNC. And so a few questions on this before we move into the questions of morality. Tell us a little bit about how you discovered this.
Something happened to the DNC?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it actually was a year ago this month that we came out publicly and announced the results of our investigation. So what had happened is that DNC had called us in to do a health check assessment of their network. And we deployed our technology that actually uses artificial intelligence to find bad stuff, malicious code on the network. And very rapidly we identified that they had not just one, but 2 intrusions into the network that once we started doing the investigations, we realized were actually tied to a nation state. So little did I know when we came out publicly with this a year ago that this would still be a major story in the headlines every single day a year later.
And how vulnerable are we to this going forward, continuing?
Well, you know, I coined a phrase 6 or 7 years ago when I said that there are only 2 types of organizations, those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know.
Yeah.
And the reality is that everyone's getting hacked, and I tell an organization that if you're not being targeted by someone, you should really worry because you have nothing valuable to steal. You should really consider why you're in business. The reality is that you have, from a threat perspective, really 3 types of adversaries that may be coming after you. You have the nation states, and from a Western, at least, perspective, the top 4 actors that we would worry about are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, not unlike the same actors that we would worry about from a physical threat perspective. Then you have the criminal groups that are out there, and they range from some of the groups that are based in Eastern Europe that are as sophisticated as some of the nation states that are out there, hugely organized criminal enterprises, many with deep connections to traditional organized crime, realizing that they can now unleash the potential of billions of dollars that you could monetize through cybercrime. And then you have the Nigerian spammers that are sending you notices asking you for your money. So it really ranges the gamut. And then you have the sort of the hacktivists / terrorist actors that are really there for vandalism and disruption and destruction. They're out to destroy your reputation, get your emails, leak them, deface your website, find other ways that they can damage you for whatever ideal that they may hold. It may be ideological, it may be political, it may be just a personal grievance.
And how prepared are we to fight and win this war? And I'm giving you now a chance to commercially sell your business,
Yeah.
but how prepared are we as a nation?
Well, this is probably one of the reasons that CrowdStrike is doing really, really well, is that there is a huge problem out there. And the reality is that this is probably, unlike almost any other area of science, will never get completely solved, right? As long as there are bad guys out there, we'll have crime, we'll have cybercrime. As long as nation states have an interest in furthering their national security goals, we will have them operate in cyberspace. That's true both of our adversaries as well as our own country. That is probably one of the best in this area when you look at our intelligence agencies. The reality is that every organization is coming under these attacks every single day. Just this week, we saw a major destructive attack that was launched against numerous companies that sort of started in Ukraine. And you could sort of look at why perhaps someone would be targeting Ukraine at this period of time, but it spread out of Ukraine and hit companies like Merck, the pharmaceutical company here in the US, Maersk, a big shipping company in Denmark, and many, many others. So these types of things really affect almost every business these days.
So, I mean, you've seen this from the inside. Is there any morality in cyber war? Is there a Geneva Convention, places you don't go, things that people shouldn't do or don't do?
Well, there is no Geneva Convention right now, and the reality is that you had a group of experts in the UN, governmental experts, including the United States, China, Russia, and many others, that have been convening for the past almost decade, trying to arrive at norms of behavior that everyone could abide by, such as let's not target civilian infrastructure, hospitals, and the like. Let's not target incident responders that are trying to fix these issues. And it's been somewhat controversial. So there are folks that in the United States takes a position that laws of war apply to cyberspace. It's just another domain of warfare. So the same sort of human rights concerns that you would have when you're targeting someone kinetically should apply in cyberspace. And there are other countries that don't hold that view and believe that the laws of war do not apply to cyberspace. And it's this entirely different thing.
So in the case of the United States and people here, do we hold to those laws in kind of when we go to cyber war?
Well, I think when you look at attacks that have been attributed now through Snowden disclosures and others to the United States, you look at how the attacks were actually crafted and the level of checks that were put in place in the code itself to make sure that it infected only the victim that it cared to infect. So, for example, when you look at an attack like Stuxnet, which has been publicly attributed to the United States and Israel, the reality is that it got out of control. It was targeting the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant in Iran for counter-proliferation efforts, but it spread out of Iran and infected millions of machines around the world, but it didn't do anything on those machines because they didn't look like the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility, so there was no destruction that was taking place. And you can sort of tell by looking at the code that there were probably a lot of lawyers that were looking over the functionality of that program to make sure that it's only doing this thing and nothing else.
Does that put the United States at a disadvantage? Does it have to do a trade-off here of ethics versus winning a cyber war?
I think we hold ourselves to a higher standard, whether it's in kinetic domain or in the cyber domain. So I'm sure we could be a lot more effective fighting terrorism around the world if we were not necessarily holding ourselves to a higher standard in terms of civilian casualties and the like. And we choose, obviously, to fight wars as morally as we can. And the same is true in cyberspace.
Got it. So I think the answer is yes.
I think so.
And so if kind of can you tell us a little bit more about this attempt to create a Geneva Convention? Kind of any idea of who the players are who are against or so on? How do we think about that?
Yeah, so it's the usual actors,
Okay.
Russia and China. They're sort of gearing up against our position and the position of the Europeans. But one of the problems with the Geneva Convention in cyberspace is how do you enforce it? The reality is that you can launch these attacks somewhat anonymously, try to obscure your attribution. And while attribution over the long term is actually really, really hard to achieve in cyberspace. So we have a saying in the cybersecurity industry that an attacker has to be, a defender has to be right 100% of the time, an attacker has to be only right once to succeed. And that is true, but when you flip it and you start looking at attribution, it actually favors the people doing the investigations, and it's really almost impossible to stay anonymous over a long period of time. So sure, just like in the physical world, it's possible to commit a perfect bank robbery and get away with it, but once you decide, wow, that worked really great, let me try to do it again and again and again, chances go up astronomically that you'll get caught, because eventually everyone makes mistakes, everyone's human. The same thing is true in cyberspace. Over the long term, you will get attributed. But the question about attribution is really a political one of how much is enough for proof. And when we look at the election last year and the interference, there's still people that don't believe it was Russia because, frankly, the U.S. government chose not to produce a lot of evidence in that regard. And they just said, we know, based on human sources, signal intercepts and the like, that this is Russia, but we're not going to tell you exactly how because we're going to endanger our sources and methods and our ability to collect on the Russians going forward.
Got it. Let's move now to kind of larger context of AI. The United States is used to being a superpower in many different ways. Is AI changing that at all?
Well, I think so. I mean, there are three trends that are really empowering this new wave of adoption of artificial intelligence. One of them is obviously the proliferation of computing power, and cloud is a huge part of that, where you can instantaneously and really cheaply these days get access to massive amounts of processing power, massive amounts of storage, which is also critical for artificial intelligence because, as the last panel showed, the training data that you need to have is really key to this. Yeah. The second is the evolution in algorithms, and we've made some tremendous moves forward in this area just in the last 4 or 5 years with new algorithms like deep learning that have been applied to new areas and allowed us to really get an order of magnitude improvement in a few areas like natural language processing and image recognition and the like. But the third area is really the proliferation of data. Right? The fact that everything today is a sensor, everything is collecting information on you. There are obviously huge privacy implications of that, but it's also helping to feed these algorithms and train them and make them a lot better.
And so how does the United States try to stay ahead, stay in the position of a superpower?
Well, I think the reality is that when you look at the fact that most of the cloud providers are based in the United States, so you've got the processing power. Yeah. You look at most of the research that's being done is in the United States, although that's starting to change in China, and others are starting to do a lot more in this area as well. I think today we still have the lead on it, and the reality is that the commercialization nature of our country, where if you have a cool idea that may have a commercial implication, can get easily funded, and you can have people make a lot of money potentially if it's successful, is still driving that innovation way more than I can see in any other country.
So you allude implicitly something, so let me kind of ask the question explicitly. Kind of, you've got infrastructure and capabilities here in the United States, but I can imagine AI will change both how and what we teach young people and how we kind of go into this infrastructure. What do we do?
Well, this is the bigger challenge that we face with automation and what jobs are going to be lost. You know, cybersecurity is one area that I think is going to have a lot of job security going forward. And even though we're leveraging AI heavily, at the end of the day, because this is a domain where there are no rules, and this is the type of domain where humans excel at. When you look at the games where AI has been successful, whether it's been chess or Go, where they've defeated humans, is because there are rigid rules, a lot of history that you can apply to train these machines to beat human beings. Cybersecurity is very different. There are no rules, and machines don't function well in that particular space. So I think that for long periods of time, both on the offensive side and the defensive side, human beings will be absolutely critical. So CrowdStrike is hiring, and I think that's one area. Another area, which is probably not where you want your kids to be working on, is the training data. So, you know, if you're building the image recognition algorithm, someone has to be clicking on that picture of cat and dog and tell the machine whether it's a cat or a dog. So I think we're going to have a lot of sort of manual tasks that will be needed going forward to provide that vital feedback mechanism to the algorithms to actually determine if they're classifying things correctly or not. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, why when you're logging into a bank account or something like that, and they're trying to validate if you're a robot or a real human being, you get this picture that pops up, whether it's a word that you have to spell out or a picture of a stop sign. How many of you are sick of finding stop signs in pictures? So that's one of the ways they're crowdsourcing this information in order to teach the algorithms what things look like.
So you talked a little bit about kind of the education. Does the way or what we teach around morality change?
I think it does, and you know, one of the things we have to appreciate about machine learning algorithms is that there's something called the ROC curve, receiver operating characteristic curve, that basically decides how effective something is going to be at the trade-off of false positive, right? Nothing is perfect. You're never going to be completely accurate, so you're always making that trade-off of, do I want more false positives, things that I'm going to call something, but it's going to be wrong, or do I want more misses and actually not identify something? And the reality is, if you just think, the previous panel talked about applications of AI to criminal justice system. When you think about an algorithm that's 99% effective, when it's applied to the human populations of 6 billion people, that's 60 million false positives you're going to have. That's right. 60 million people that are going to be called a criminal that are not. So when you start thinking about applying machine learning to those areas, and I'll leave it as a math exercise to the audience to figure out how many nines you need to have in the accuracy of the algorithm to actually get it to a level of low false positives that we could accept as a society. And that's one of the big challenges that we face, is we think that machines are smarter than us, and when it comes to processing lots and lots of data and coming up with a decision, they certainly are, but they do make mistakes, and in fact, every algorithm will have mistakes that you will code in the algorithm. You'll decide what the false positive level is going to be and how much you're going to accept from an accuracy perspective for the algorithm. The other big problem that we face with machine learning is that when it arrives at a decision, most of the time you cannot tell why, right? It just tells you that I've looked at 5 million characteristics of you and your history, and I just decided that in this massive hyperspace, you land here, and the probability of you being a criminal is 99%. Why you landed here, I couldn't tell you, because there are 5 million factors at play that put you in this position in the hyperspace. And that creates a lot of problems when you're trying to actually take action based on this data, but you don't know fundamentally why we're calling someone good or bad.
So 2 quick questions, and I'm going to move over to the audience. One is, that false positive is still without even taking into account all the biases in the algorithm itself, right?
Oh, that's right. Well, you have a number of biases. The decision, how many false positives to accept, can be biased. The training data can be biased. The parameters that you supply to the system can be biases. And when it comes to machine learning, in many of the algorithms that you use with supervised learning, you actually decide what characteristics you're going to use.
Yeah.
So I'm going to decide whether the color of your skin is going to matter or not, right? Whether it's going to be a differentiating factor. So those types of things, of course, are a critical part of those biases that we get exposed to.
And then last easy question, who's to blame when the machine makes a mistake?
Well, that's probably the hardest question of all.
Yeah.
Do you blame the programmer? Do you blame the guy that was clicking on the cat and dog pictures and supplying the training data? I think at the end of the day, we have to realize that machine learning is going to be one input into the overall decision. So for example, in cybersecurity, we don't just rely on machine learning. That's why human beings are critical. When we came into the DNC and the machine learning algorithms identified potentially malicious activity, guess what? We had humans review it, make sure it wasn't false positives, and then start diving deep into what this meant. So when it comes to really critical decisions, I hope that in most cases humans will still be in the loop to make that final call.
Got it. Okay, move to the audience. Any questions? Lulled you all to sleep? No, right there.
Do you think that AI will ever be developed enough that it will be ethical to use it to make decisions in criminal justice by itself, or do you think that it will always need the human element?
I mean, personally, who knows, hundreds of years to the future, I think for the foreseeable future, you will always want to have someone look at the data and make sure that no biases were introduced or the machine simply did make a mistake. Again, I don't think we're at the point where the accuracy of those algorithms is good enough that when you look at the overall population and you start thinking about how many millions of people are going to be impacted when the machine is going to make a mistake with what we know is the false positive rate of that algorithm, that's going to be a huge problem. And one of the areas of artificial intelligence that we still struggle with is the area where you still have highly unbiased data. Unbiased classes. So for example, most people in the world are not criminals. They're only a small percentage of the overall population. So when you start thinking about a false positive rate of 99%, most of those 60 million people that you're going to identify are going to be completely law-abiding people.
Yeah. I think I saw a question that, one behind, in the second row.
I have a question which is a little bit philosophical about if you have concerns, or I'll say I have concerns, I'm curious what you think about the morality of a language system, like that the machines learn and that they're intelligent and how they come to a conclusion, how that impacts the dignity and sanctity of human life. Because human beings think and make decisions and have reasoning and learn and they're intelligent, but when you say there's a smart grid or the machine is learning, it sort of breaks down the distinction between human beings and human reasoning and human learning and what a machine can do. And I think the implications for that in regard to how people think about machines and people, for me, is one of the most troubling moral questions.
So, and I may be in the minority on this, but I'm not concerned about sentient machines, and I'm not concerned about artificial intelligence in the sense of the machines taking over the world. What I'm mostly concerned about is what I call artificial stupidity. And the fact of the matter is that the humans beings, for better or for worse, are still controlling those algorithms, still controlling those machines, and the biases and the mistakes, frankly, that we can introduce into those algorithms can cause a lot of problems for us in the physical world. That's what I'm mostly concerned about, not machines developing an intelligence of their own and the HAL 9000 type of scenario developing. I think we're very far away from that.
I'm not concerned about them actually taking over and being intelligent. I'm just actually questioning how we talk about it and how it impacts us, that we think about them as if they're alive, as if they're human beings. That was my question.
Okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. No, I think that's a great question, and certainly we're starting to relate to our systems more and more, and there was great research that was done on that topic with the dinosaurs that are going to be the robotic dinosaurs that people don't want to destroy because they have an affiliation with them, and they start relating to them. I think that we're going to see more and more of, absolutely, and that's going to cause all kinds of issues for us down the road.
this question of language does become
Attachment, yeah.
incredibly important too. Of kind of as language gets mixed up, right? Kind of how does our thinking and approach to that also get mixed up as well? Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience as well.
So we're going to talk about something Dmitri touched on, which is the inexplicability, the inscrutability of the outputs of these smart systems. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Joanna and Gary to say who they are and where they're coming from, partly because I'm lazy, but also because I want them just to position themselves within the larger AI community.
Oh, well, that's that. Well, my name is Joanna Bryson. I really am an AI expert. I'm not one of the people that talks about AI ethics and doesn't do AI. So we build intelligent systems in my group. But I got into that because I was a psychologist and I wanted to do scientific simulations. So I actually do spend a lot of time working on understanding human cooperation, which has actually been useful lately too. And I guess, yeah, those are the three things I've been working on. Science of cognition, how do you make it easier to build intelligent systems? And then more recently, a lot of my time has been going into AI ethics.
And you are at the University of Bath.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm at the University of Bath. I'm an associate professor, and I'm also an affiliate at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton.
I'm Gary Marcus. I'm a cognitive scientist. I study how children learn language, but that has brought me into studying AI. I recently built a machine learning company that tried to learn more efficiently from data called Geometric Intelligence, which I sold to Uber. And I will soon, I think, be launching another AI company.
You wrote a good book, too.
I've written several books. I hope you liked at least one of them.
But I mean the popular one on learning the guitar.
I'm author of Guitar Zero, which is a bestseller.
Yeah. So, Joanna, what does it mean when we say that we don't fully understand how deep learning systems produce the outputs that they do? Now, someone in the audience said, I've come to a talk which I know nothing about. So I want you to simultaneously please the experts by being exactly technically accurate, but to explain to people like me who know nothing what that statement means.
All right, sure, no problem. We have to do this for first-year undergraduates, too, actually, in computer science departments. Half of them already know how to program, and half of them don't. Have to keep them all happy. Hopefully, I haven't oversold myself now. Right, to the point. One of the many ways that we do machine learning, and one of the many ways we make algorithms, I mean, some algorithms we just type and we write in things, right? So we could just put our human biases directly in there. But one of the ways we do it is something called deep learning, which is a form of neural networks. And when people say we can't possibly understand what neural networks does, what they mean is that you have a whole lot of little nodes and you have a whole lot of little weights connecting the little nodes. It's sort of inspired by the brain. And we don't know what each little connection between each little node, what exactly that does, how exactly that contributed. So when people say it's impossible to understand that, it's like, well, yeah, that is, you're never going to know what every little bit is doing. On the other hand, when we look and try to understand a system, as psychologists, for example, we don't go in and try to understand every neuron in the brain to figure out whether or not a pigeon can learn to peck to get food, right? We look and see what it does. And so there are ways to go in and look at deep learning just in terms of, okay, what happens if we train it on another system? What happens if we take a particular CV and it said, don't hire this person? Well, let's vary a couple of characteristics and see if then it says we should hire them. So there are ways we can do due diligence without going back in and understanding every single weight on every single neuron of a model.
Thank you. Gary, that sounds like a fidgety and uncomfortable way to do things. Looking back at the history of AI, why didn't we just make general rules that encoded intelligence in a way that we could easily understand?
Because those are fidgety and uncomfortable in a different way. So, I mean, historically, there have been two approaches. The other one is what you're talking about. The rules are typically more transparent. They can have their own problems. So the most impressive set of rules in some ways is Doug Lennett's Psych system, which tried to encode all the knowledge in the real world. But there are, I don't know, on the order of 100,000 or a million rules there. And if you ask it to make an inference like, why are you wearing shoes today? It might be able to come up with some long narrative. And you can probably read through it, but it's probably more complicated than you think is correct. So there's not any guarantee in, I think, any direction of complete transparency of systems. When you work with rules, people try to build procedures to try to make those rules more interpretable. I do think that the current approach that's popular to machine learning is not putting a premium on interpretability. And at some sense, the worry is like someone's going to get killed by a driverless car, and someone's going to ask a question, why did my son get killed? And the answer is going to be, well, position number 317 was a positive number instead of a negative number. And it's not going to feel very satisfying. And I think that is a real risk. So there are problems in all directions here in terms of how to make systems interpretable. They're serious with the deep learning systems, but they're not trivial with the old, fidgety, uncomfortable stuff either.
Can we jump in?
Yes, please. I meant to jump in.
So there is absolutely, either system can be obscure. And so what we have to decide as a society, and this is a very important thing, artificial intelligence is not like somebody conceived an algorithm and then it spontaneously generates itself and there's a robot suddenly and it has sentience or whatever. The word artificial means it's an artifact. Every single AI system has been built by someone for a purpose. And particularly if it's a commercial product, then we can regulate that. And we can say, we want to be able to have some level of accountability. And the European Union has said that. They have said, and now it's going to take time like everything else. It's going to take time in the courts to decide what level of explanation is actually going to be required. But we can mandate that at least for commercial products, there is these various levels of accountability, whether it's tracing back and saying who is in charge of operating it, which is what the US military has decided is the way they, at last I knew, they literally defined, Heather will know this better, where did she go?
Should have go to her talk.
The last I knew, they actually define something if it's in the field as working. So now the programmer is off the hook and the operator is the only one responsible and their chain of command.
It so happens right now, if I can jump in briefly, that there's kind of an economic cost to interpretability. So sometimes there are ways to make more interpretable models with old-fashioned architectures. Some things like random forests, for example, can be more interpretable, but they don't get quite the same performance. So there's an economic question to be battled out, and I don't know how it's going to go, where you can make something more interpretable, but maybe you get weaker results. So deep learning is really optimized for results for a certain class of problems that I would call classifiers. And for those classification problems, if you have enough data, it's the best technique, but it's not the most interpretable technique. And there can be a lot of economics at stake there.
Yeah, but even, as I said, even within that, we can then go and interrogate the system. And yeah, it's fiddly, but we all talk about underemployment and stuff. It's not, we'll find people to do that.
I see some furrowed brows in the audience, and they're asking, why does it matter? Why do we care? If a system isn't fully explicable, if it's not interpretable, why do we care how a AI puts someone on parole, gives insurance, grants a loan, so long as the predictive probability is extremely high?
There are several issues. One is about bias, which you alluded to. Another that we haven't touched on is debuggability. So one of the concerns I have about using deep learning as a dominant paradigm is it's not very debuggable. It works for a certain set of data, but you don't have guarantees that it'll work for another set of data, and you don't understand enough about how it does what it does to be sure that if the data change, that you're going to be able to use it well. Peter Norvig had a nice line about this, which is like, in classical engineering, you build things with tolerances, you put them together, you know how they work. In machine learning, you kind of try it and it works on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and you hope that on Christmas, the scenario isn't so different that the whole thing breaks down. And so I think that's a serious issue.
That's absolutely right. I was just looking up a name. I just really want to say very quickly. There was a fantastic series of lectures about this. It's called the Sackler series that was done by the Royal Society and the National Academy of Sciences in January of this year. And there was a woman, Cynthia Rubin, who showed a system that was exceeding, when she made it more transparent, she was able to debug it better, and then it did actually turn out to be better. That's not to say that that's the only way to do it, but the point is exactly what you're saying. Transparency in the algorithms and the way we construct things, and even just deciphering and going back and seeing these things, also allows us to optimize them better. So it's a little bit like green. Sometimes when you go out and you think, oh, we're going to spend more money because we're going to try to be more environmentally sustainable, you actually wind up saving money because you're doing things that are sustainable.
That's right. There may be a short-term benefit to doing the deep learning stuff the way that it is, so you get the best performance right now, but it could be very short-term in that it's not the way to get to a robust enough system. So if you're talking about something like driverless cars, you need 99 we had this example before, many nines, right? And to get to the many nines, deep learning might not get you there at all. You might need a different architecture precisely because you don't know how to debug it. So if you need that accuracy level, maybe the economics actually go back in the other direction.
Jan LeCun at Facebook has a bad joke. Why did the convolutional neural net cross the road? What do you care, so long as it works? But he's making a broader point.
But what about the day in which it didn't cross the road and it?
But his point is that if the crossing the road is more predictable and performs better than ordinary human actors, isn't that a sufficiently good cost?
It reminds me of the debate about behaviorism in cognitive psychology. And last I checked, cognitive psychology won. So I mean, there was a debate in the 1950s. Skinner wanted to explain everything in terms of reinforcement history, and it turned out there were a lot of sophisticated things you couldn't really account for that. Well, in that framework. So Skinner wrote his book Verbal Behavior, and Chomsky, in his best written piece ever, which he wrote as a young man when people didn't just transcribe his speech, wrote this brilliant review of Skinner's verbal behavior and pointed out all the ways in which it was never really going to explain complex linguistic intercommunication. I think there's something almost exactly parallel here, where the deep learning can give you a kind of behaviorist account where you get some kind of most frequent reply to something. So you get Shakespeare, or at least it looks like Shakespeare at the word level, but you can't get Shakespeare at the discourse level. You never actually get beyond that initial superficiality.
I want to go the other direction and say you're right. And that's part of the thing of doing good systems engineering. If you do go out and you do interrogate the system and you are sure it's going to be reliably working, then it doesn't matter exactly what little weights are doing what, right? Yeah. You have a module in the system, and if you have demonstrated it's bulletproof. So I was shocked when I was
my
brought in.
ancestors have a
Let me finish this. And don't interrupt women, it's bad. We're in
it's discussion about that.
Yeah. So where were we? When I was actually called in to talk to a medical reasoning group once, and I said, my stuff is not formal. You can't prove that's correct. And they said, in medicine, the only proof is experiments. We don't trust it otherwise. So yes, if you get a module that you have verified by the kinds of procedures that we use for medicine and everything else, then sure, incorporate it in your procedure. On the other hand, to play the other advocate back again, there have been courts of law that have said, if you don't reveal your algorithms to us, and let's be frank about this, a lot of these things, this obfuscation, they are things that have just been written. They're like Excel programs. But people say, oh, it's proprietary, this is our trade secret. There needs to be a recognized right and responsibility for auditing these projects, especially if they're making decisions about people's lives. And Idaho and Texas have both had decisions along this way that it doesn't have to be you, but someone doesn't have access to an explanation about how the algorithm that is determining recidivism or even benefits, all kinds of things, then that's a failure of due process, right? So due process demands that there should be someone who can go in and check that the algorithm has been constructed correctly.
So the point that I'd jump in on, though, is about robustness. So in principle, if you have something that you know is reliable enough, then you can be kind of behaviorist about it. It's a black box and it doesn't matter. But what happens if you have a system that's mostly reliable but not always? So this is what happens with the driverless cars, is maybe it's 99% correct. You have a pedestrian detector, it's 99% correct. That sounds great, but it's obviously not good enough, right? You don't want to kill people one in every 100 times out of the gate. So if you're not reliable enough, that's when I think it really matters.
Well, and it also depends on the application. If you have a toy, it actually turned out, again, some people I saw at the Media Lab once, they had something that didn't do very good vision recognition, so it didn't understand gestures. And it seemed more human-like then because sometimes it didn't do what they told them to do it. And when they fixed the vision to solve another problem, people no longer thought that the little avatars they had was intelligent.
So I want to take some questions from the audience, but before I do, I want to recall something that Joanna said to me and Gary last night at dinner, which really piqued my interest. She said that we already have lots of AI. It's essentially machine learning. We've become used to it, and it's enriched our lives in extraordinary ways. But you said what we need is more human sentience. What did you mean?
Well, sometimes we hold AI systems to a higher standard than humans, and we should. As I said, they're artifacts. We can inspect them in ways we can't inspect humans. But I think we need to recognize that a lot of the things that we're building, including our governments and these companies and these design processes, which will have a whole lot of different companies providing different libraries, whatever, these things aren't transparent enough. So we need to be more sentient of how we are as organisms, as organizations, I guess, as participants in organizations, and understanding our roles and understanding, for example, I've been attending a lot of the future of work stuff too. One of the problems when people outsource and they send something away, they think, oh, look, these workers are cheaper in another country. they aren't looking at all of the benefits that they're getting for the money that they're paying in a particular community that might include robustness, reliability, sense of rule of law. There's all kinds of things that people haven't figured out a proper costing for. So I'm just saying we need more awareness of everything. And AI might be one of the ways that we'll gain more awareness of some pieces. In fact, maybe too much, back to privacy.
You're saying we should be more conscious of how we use technology rather than allowing technology or brute market force to use us.
Yes, and not only technology, also, as I said, corporate structure.
This gentleman in the... Oh, wait for the mic, say who you are and where you're from, and those short statements are acceptable, questions are more polite and interesting.
Yes, Bill Nitza from Washington and Aspen. I want to pick up on the deep learning Shakespeare point. First, we don't yet understand how the human brain makes decisions, and we can't hold ourselves accountable for what happens chemically and physically within our heads, because we just don't know how all the loops and connections work. And we have situations like the famous Mr. Gage, who had a spike driven through his head, and we sort of understand why his behavior changed in the way it did, but we don't entirely understand it. Now, going over to deep learning, if the feedback loops go not 15 deep, not 150 deep, not 500 deep, but 20,000 deep, 100,000 deep, 1 million deep, aren't we approaching systems which are going to operate at the same level of complexity as the human brain? And if so, isn't there a certain convergence with respect to the issues we're discussing?
I was going to ask Gary this, actually. What if intelligence is definitionally unknowable? What if, as our systems become more complicated, they are simply mysterious?
I mean, I think it's certainly possible that they're unknowable. I don't think merely adding more layers to a deep network is getting us that close to the brain. I also do a lot of neuroscience, and as a neuroscientist, I think I look at the deep learning networks and think they're nothing like how the human brain works, except maybe one particular piece. They might be like the low-level perceptual areas, like V1 is a low-level visual area. But for example, I was talking to Christoph Koch a couple days ago. He runs the Paul Allen's Brain Institute, and they're like something like 100 different neuron types in each cortical area that he's looked at in the mouse, and about 50 of them are the same in each area, 50 of them are different. In a neural network, we have essentially one or two, depending on how you count. One neuron, we have an excitatory and an inhibitory neuron that are sort of convolved together into a single thing. So it's completely different in some of the details from the human brain and the machine brain. There's also, I think, enormous differences in terms of what machine brains and human brains are good at, and just adding more layers I don't think is fundamentally going to change that. I have actually some proofs about that with respect to certain questions about generalization and so forth. The other part of the point is, I mean, I think it's certainly true that there's lots of unknowability about humans. Humans at least can do one trick that machines can't for now, which is to verbalize what they do. So
yeah, but it's a rationalization.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's a rationalization. Sometimes people can be pretty articulate about what they do. In the music book, actually, I had an opportunity to interview a lot of great musicians, and there are some, like Pat Metheny, that can give an explanation for absolutely everything they do, and other musicians for which it's entirely intuitive. So there's certainly a range.
Yeah, if I could just say very quickly, we are held accountable. You know, if you attack me, you're going to jail. And so we are accountable for what we do. And that's a similar kind of thing that we were talking about.
I think we have to move on to the next
question.
We have to move on. There were several people.
I've got time for 2 more questions, I think.
There was a woman over there.
And a woman would be good somewhere. Yes.
Balanced.
Hi, Mickey McManus from Autodesk. I guess a lot of the work that we've seen coming out of machine learning, and this work has come from cognitive psychology research over a long time, or at least some of it, some threads. And I've worked with cognitive psychologists for a very long time. I'm curious if at some point we will have machine cognitive psychologists to maybe help decode what these machines are doing.
It is exactly what's happening right now. Is there's a whole movement within the deep learning field to do what looks to me as a cognitive psychologist really more like single-cell neurophysiology, but which is related to cognitive psychology. So people are like, what does this neuron respond to? What kind of neat tricks can I do with background priors to better understand what this neuron's doing? So it's very much borrowed either consciously or unconsciously or reinvented, but it's very much the same kinds of techniques as people did in single-cell neurophysiology, which they really got from cognitive psychology.
Well, and if anything, I think because of this over-identification with artificial intelligence that was mentioned in the Q&A in the previous panel, there's probably more people defining themselves that way than really need to be. Right, so.
And the last question goes to Kitty.
Okay. So my question is, having read Flash Boys a few years ago, the one thing that I took away from that book was the lack of appreciation by the top leaders of a company in what the technology was actually doing. And as AI becomes part of everything we do, how are current business leaders going to actually be able to ask the right questions about things like bias, and are we doing this correctly, if they don't speak the language of the AI in the first place?
I think you have to credit someone like Zuckerberg for actually like spending a summer trying to actually learn to code and so forth. So, I mean, the best thing to do is what Zuckerberg did there, which is you try to build something yourself and you start to understand some of the logic and the limitations and so forth.
One of my colleagues, Bob Lord, has said that every single company ought to have somebody, even at right at the very basic startup stage, there should be somebody on the board that's in charge of security. Even if they don't even understand it, because it's hard to hire those people, just to have someone whose full-time job is to think about security, which honestly, I think security is the biggest problem in AI right now. But there are people who are saying the same thing about AI. So it is that big of a deal that maybe governments are going to need to have, just like we do for medicine and the environment, artificial intelligence is altering society enough that maybe government should have that. And similarly, it may be something you need to have expertise on at the board level.
Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Marcus, Joanna Bresson, thank you very much.